This is my 147th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is another little rolling stock kit build, specifically of a MAJ Models kit for a Lancashire and Yorkshire Railways sliding door van. I'll cover the kit build in detail as usual, then I'll get out a newly acquired locomotive, this time a Bachmann 3F tender engine, and we'll look at that and then have a little running with the kit-built van. Here's the kit, another of those that I picked up from the $1 bargain box at the Great British Train Show in Brampton, Ontario, Canada at the end of April. This one was the only one of the $1 kits that I picked up that came in a box, which turned out to be a mixed blessing since the box wasn't sealed and it turned out that some of the small parts were missing. Mind you, with the last kit that I built, the oversized coal wagon, the wheels that were supposed to be included were missing and that one came in a sealed bag. MAJ had attempted to keep the small parts from going astray by taping them to an instruction sheet, but these kits were so old that the tape had perished and the small parts had mostly drifted off. It would have been a better bet to put the small parts into their own sealed bag, which is, I believe, what Pico now do with their kits, but then these kits are old. This was what was left of the small brass parts that should have been taped to the sheet. 2 bearings and 3 buffer heads. There should have been 4 of each, of course. There were 2 instruction sheets, one basically a standard sheet for the chassis and then a separate small sheet for this specific van. Both sheets were 2-sided, and here are the other sides. I did look at all of the instructions, but I have to admit that I paid almost no attention to them during the assembly, except for a couple of minor points. With the last of these MAJ kits that I built, the oversized coal wagon, I followed the instructions meticulously step by step, and they led me completely astray, leaving me having to do awkward bodges to complete the assembly. This time I figured that I knew what was going on, since this kit used the same chassis parts, so I just winged it based on how I felt the assembly ought to go from my experiences with the last one. Here are the parts, the same black sprue of parts for the chassis as last time, then separate grey parts for the van walls and roof, and wheels and axles not missing this time, plus the small parts that you already saw for strips of grey plastic and brass bearings and buffer heads, some of which were missing. I had a bag of brass bearings that I'd bought for spares. These weren't exactly the same as the ones included with the kit, but they were quite similar. First, I separated out the wagon floor from the sprue. The small black circular parts on the end go with the buffer heads. I left them attached when initially detaching the floor, as this seemed safer. The instructions said to use a saw to detach parts from the sprue. I can sort of understand this, as some of the attachment points were quite robust, but I used a sharp knife. I cut the small circular parts for the buffers from the floor part as cleanly as I could manage, and I put them into my small parts tray. You can see the bearings that came with the kit at bottom right here, and the ones from my bag of spares at left. I knew that it was going to be necessary to cut down the floor, as the chassis parts are designed to make either a 12-foot or a 10-foot 6-inch chassis, and this wagon was 10-foot 6-inch. The chassis sprue does provide some separate parts for the 2 lengths, but for the floor just one part is provided, which you need to cut down for the shorter chassis. What I'm doing in this picture is trying the end of the van and the side of the van to see how they will fit together, and marking the side part to show where the floor will need to come to. I did that at both ends of one of the sides, and then tried that against the floor. When I did that, I saw that there was in fact a fine line on the floor showing where it needed to be cut down for the shorter chassis, but I felt more comfortable having checked the required lengths myself. Here's more of a close-up of the line showing where the floor needs to be cut. It's a pretty thick part, so cutting wasn't really easy. I used a steel ruler and a knife to start the cut, then deepened it more with a razor saw, and then finally broke off the end with pliers. Here are the 4 axle hangers. I needed to fit the brass bearings into these and to make sure that the ones from my spares bag would stay in place. The bearings from the kit are at the bottom and my spares at top. You can see that they're a bit different, but I think they will work together okay. The kit bearings were such a tight fit that they just pushed in. I did use a little glue to hold my spares in place. Here are the sole bars for the shorter chassis. Separate sole bar parts are provided for the 2 lengths. There are holes in the back of the bars into which the lugs on the axle hangers will fit, giving the hangers a positive location. Here are the 2 sole bars with the axle hangers glued in place. Since I knew from my previous build that I was going to have problems passing a rod for the brake pivoting, I drilled out the hole in the brake hanger to 30 thou at this point, as I will use 30 thou styrene rod. I also drilled out the holes in the brake lever and the main brake shoe assembly, since the rod will need to pass through all of these. Here are the sole bars assembled to the cut-down floor. They fit up against a step in the side of the floor part and are held at the correct angle by flats protruding from the axle hangers, which fit flush to the floor. The sole bars did seem to be just a bit longer than the cut-down floor. Next, I popped the axles into the bearings. They seem to fit and to rotate fine. Following that, I glued the coupling mount for the cut-down end in place, flush with the end of the floor. The instructions say to glue the buffer beams in place at this point, but that makes no sense, as I found out last time, since the ends of the body have buffer beams included in them, so you really don't want to use the buffer beams from the chassis sprue. I sanded down the ends a bit, since, as noted, the sole bars were a bit longer than the floor, so they weren't quite flush. Next, for the brake assembly. As before, I went for manual brakes rather than vacuum brakes, as being simpler and more consistent with most of my freight stock. The kit provided a part 12, for the axle of the brake assembly, which is seen at centre right here, the little black rod. But it was too fat to go through the holes, and it wasn't even really round, it was closer to square. So as before, I just cut a piece of 30 thou styrene rod to length to serve as the brake axle. The brake assembly for the shorter wheelbase was actually broken on the sprue before I even started to detach it, perhaps just due to shaking of the box, so I had to repair it, and you can see my rather messy repair at top centre. I had trouble getting the thin ends to glue together. I put my styrene rod through the hole in this part first. It was a lot easier this time knowing what I was doing. Altogether, this kit build was much faster than the first of these MAJ kits that I did. I spent pretty much a whole week on that one, with quite a bit of puzzling out what the instructions meant and some toing and froing to get things together. I did this whole build in the same day now that I knew what I was trying to achieve. I threaded the small lever part onto my rod, and then I got that whole assembly between the 2 hangers on the sole bars. Then I glued the ends of the rod into the hangers. And then I positioned the brake shoe assembly with the shoes just clear of the wheels and glued it to the floor. I used liquid solvent, which made a bit of a mess, but no one's going to see it there. Finally, I slid the little lever part up against the hangers on the sole bar and glued that in place. 2 brake-operating levers were provided for the hand-operated brakes, although they looked about the same length to me. I separated the one that looked the best bet from the sprue and cleaned it up. I glued that lever in place. It does look rather long for this chassis, but the other one didn't really look any shorter to me, and basically, honestly, the other one was rather malformed on the sprue, so I thought I'd better go with this one. So at this point, I essentially had a completed rolling chassis. The mark on the floor is from tape, and it was so old that I couldn't get it off even with mineral spirits, but it will be inside the van, so no one will see it. Here's one side of the special sheet about assembling the van. There could be doors in the roof, but you'd have to make those yourself, which didn't look at all promising, so I went for a roof without doors. The little strips of grey plastic that came in the box were apparently to make beams on the van ends, arranged differently depending whether or not roof doors were present, as shown here. Here's one of the parts for the ends of the van, including the buffer beam, as you can see, and above are the 4 small strips of grey plastic for the beams. I held the end part against the drawing on the instruction sheet to mark where the bottoms of the beams should go. I glued the beams in place based on my marks, more or less. Once the glue set, I cut off the tops of the beams where they protruded above the ends. I sanded the tops of the beams a bit also. The chassis sprue did include plastic parts for buffer heads, and I decided to use those since I only had 3 brass buffer heads for this kit. I cut the plastic buffer head parts from the sprue and cleaned them up. These little circular parts were supposed to go round the buffer head shafts. Here is one of the plastic buffer heads with a small circular part fitted round its shaft. That assembly then glued into the buffer stem on the van end. Here are all 4 buffer assemblies glued in place. I don't think they look too bad. These are the little parts for the coupling hooks. I lost one of these when doing my previous MAJ assembly. This time I managed to get them both off the sprue without losing them. I glued the coupling hooks into place on the buffer beams, although in hindsight it would probably have been best to have left this until after the assembly of the van body, as the hooks just got in the way during that assembly. Next, the body needs to be assembled on the chassis. I started by gluing one end in place with the top of the buffer beam flush with the end of the floor. Then I glued one side in place, gluing the mitered edge to the end and the strip along the bottom to the side of the floor. Next I glued the other end in place. Before gluing the last side on, I fixed a couple of self-adhesive weights onto the floor over the axles. When I came to attach the last side, it didn't want to sit down properly on the ends, so I sanded down the bar on the bottom to allow it to sit tighter against the chassis. I just about got the last side to glue into place at the ends after sanding down that bottom strip. Mostly I hadn't painted this model, as the kit parts seemed to be the correct colours. However, I didn't feel that the roof should be the same grey as the walls, so I spray painted the roof white. Somewhat to my annoyance, I realised after painting it that I needed to cut the roof down. Why? I mean, this part was supplied separately, not on the chassis sprue, so why couldn't a part the correct length have been included? But clearly the roof was too long, and there is a line on it showing where to cut. Given that the roof was curved and thick, it wasn't going to be easy to cut. I used a cutting disc in a rotary tool. Then I cleaned up by sanding and then painted the edges of the roof white manually. I got out 2 Bachmann wide couplings for the van. I've been using these as my standard couplings for kits, as they can be mounted to most kits where the kit doesn't include couplings, and they're fairly forgiving in coupling to both old and new stock. The pins on the kit coupling mounts were a bit too big to fit into the holes in the Bachmann couplings, so I drilled out the holes in the couplings with an appropriately sized bit in a pin vise. Then the couplings just popped into place on the coupling mounts. At this point my van was almost complete. I decided that I would decal the body before mounting the roof. Apart from anything else, I wanted to let the paint on the roof dry more. I got out an HMRS press fix set for the LMS letters, and I used a Model Master set for running numbers. There are numbers in the press fix set, but you have to assemble the running number digit by digit, which is a hellish fiddly job. I cut out 2 matching running numbers from the Model Master set, which is Waterslide. I can't imagine why Model Master chose to print the set on backing paper that's almost white, given that all of the decals are white, so it makes it almost impossible to see what you're doing. I used Microset to help with applying the Waterslide running number decals. I cut round small LMS lettering sets on the press-fix sheet. The trick with the press-fix decals is to cut gently so that you go through the top mounting sheet but not through the backing card. Then you just peel the mounting sheet off the backing card. I put the LMS letters above the diagonal beam in the door. This does seem to have been one way that LMS letters were applied on wagons with sliding doors. Finally, I glued the roof in place. The roof was a bit too glossy, but I'll be doing a final spray of matte acrylic. I put masking tape over the wheels before the final spray, as I didn't want to spray the moving parts. Here's the wagon back from being sprayed with clear matte acrylic fixative. This was mainly to protect the decals, although it does also make the overall finish look better, I think. I touched up the white rod on the bottom with black paint. And now the wagon assembly was finished. However, when I tried it on my little test track, the darn thing wouldn't run. It rolled fine on a flat surface, but on the rails it went about 2 inches and then derailed every time. I was not happy, and initially I was somewhat mystified. It turned out that the problem was the gauging of the wheels. I just assumed that the axles as they came in the box would be properly assembled. But when I checked the back-to-back gauging, one axle was about 14.6 millimeters and the other was about 13.3 millimeters. Even on straight track that wouldn't work, causing the van to fall off the rails after a couple of inches. I had to take the axles out of the bearings and force the wheels to slide to re-gauge them to something approximating to the standard 14.4 millimeters. Then when I put the wheels back on, they wouldn't run as the brake shoes were touching them, since I had glued the brake shoe assembly into place based on the original assembly of the axles. So I had to bend the brake assembly so that it cleared the wheels, and I did finally get the van running without derailing or stopping. That done, I wanted to actually run the van on a layout. I decided that I would get out another pending loco to do that. I bought this Bachmann 3F tender loco locally here in Canada at the same time as I bought the 3F Ginty tank engine that I ran with my previous MAJ kit. There was a small detail pack with the Bachmann 3F, just a speaker mount with screws and 2 3-link couplings. Here's the 3F still in its interior block of ice packaging. Apart from a couple of standard Bachmann sheets, there was one sheet particular to this model. One side had this exploded parts diagram. The other side had some details on body removal, DCC fitting, and fitting of extra parts. My model came with the vacuum pipes already fitted to the buffer beams, so either a previous owner did that or Bachmann sold it that way. Here's the back of the Bachmann box with some details about the class. Many of this class were built and they remained common throughout the existence of the LMS. The successor class, the 4F Duck 6, is perhaps better known, but the 3Fs continued to work alongside their later cousins, even being fairly common on branch passenger services. Here's the end of the box showing the exact version that I got. This model does use Bachmann's stupid way of connecting loco and tender. They seem to do this still on pretty much all of their models, despite many people having told them that it's a terrible idea, likely to lead to damage, as the pin tends to come off, leaving, well, sometimes the pins do break, and even if they don't break, they tend to come out of the hole in the drawbar, leaving the loco pulling trains by nothing but the wires. This particular model wasn't as bad as some, with the pin being a little easier to keep engaged with the drawbar, although it isn't engaged here. The model was nice looking, although there was nothing fancy about the livery, being just plain unlined black. It ran fine forwards and backwards on my test track. It took a little more power than I was expecting, but really low gearing makes absolute sense for an engine like this, which was clearly intended for haulage, not speed. I got the 3F onto my Hornby layout for running in. Even though it was used, I figure it's always best to run in newly acquired models. I do think Bachmann have done a nice job with this one. The cab is particularly well finished, with separately painted floor and walls and controls neatly picked out in several colours. The tender is well done as well, with good detail and appropriate markings. Both loco and tender buffers are sprung. Here's the 3F passing the baby monitor that I use so that I can monitor running in from another room. I ran in the 3F for 30 minutes forwards and 30 minutes backwards with no issues. Having run in the 3F, I coupled it up with the newly built van along with the oversized coal wagon built from the previous MAJ kit and a Hornby brake van bringing up the rear. In a way, the plastic buffer heads worked out better than the brass ones. The brass buffer heads were so long that when combined with the relatively short Bachmann couplings, they tended to lead to buffer lock on curves. The plastic heads result in shorter buffers, less likely to cause buffer lock. Here's the back of the coal wagon with brass buffers coupled to the Hornby brake van, just about enough play in the couplings here to avoid buffer lock. And here's the front of the van, coupled to the loco tender, lots of room here, maybe even too much, with the shorter buffers and quite a long coupling on the tender. So there we are, the two wagons built from MAJ kits in a little train. Now let's see a bit of running. Okay, let's just see a little bit of running video. We got the Bachmann 3F tender engine on the front there. Very nice cab he has. Very impressive cab detail. I don't know whether I can get that in focus properly for you though. Just very nice. And then we've got the kit built wagons, the one I just built, the van, and the oversized coal wagon that I built before, and I put on the back the Hornby brake van, which I was having problems before with it derailing, so I swapped it out when I was previously running the coal wagon. I think maybe there was just I did vacuum the track afterwards. I think maybe there was a bit of ballast on the track, and it's rather lightweight, that Hornby brake van. Or maybe I didn't have it coupled up quite right, I don't know. Anyway, I think it's working now, but we'll see. So let's try and apply some power. Up to about 50% freight speed. I've got more of these kits. I think I've got 2 more of the oversized coal wagon kits. Don't have any more of the vans. That was the only van they had. But I've got 2 more of the oversized coal wagon kits. And then I've got also another kit for a sort of shallow wagon, like a 3-plank wagon or something. Same chassis, but I think it's the short version of it. You have to make the short version of the chassis, so you have to cut it down, and it's you know, like a shallow wagon. That other kits, I've got 3 more of those kits. I wish I'd built more of them now. I mean, they've had some problems. They were missing some parts. This one was missing 2 of its this kit was missing 2 of its bearings and 1 of its buffers. It actually runs better with a plastic buffers. Those metal buffers, the problem with those metal buffers, well, you could cut them down, I suppose, but as they come, they're rather long, so they protrude a long way, and you tend to get buffer lock if you're not careful. But I think these build quite nice wagons, and it's, you know, I just enjoy building the kits. I mean, it's just, you know, an enjoyable thing to do in itself, building the kits. Requires a bit of improvisation, especially, well, these require a bit of improvisation anyway, because the instructions are a bit vague, and also, especially if they're missing parts, it requires a bit of improvisation, but it's an interesting thing to do. And see, I think these are running quite nicely as wagons. Now I had to re-gauge the wheels that came with this one. It wouldn't run at all without derailing initially, but the van. The coal wagon has actually got wheels out of a Pico kit. The wheels were missing from that kit, so the issue didn't, well, I didn't re-gauge those, but then they weren't MAJ wheels. They were from a Pico kit. I know one of the other, I'm missing a set of wheels from one of the other large coal wagon kits, basically because I stole them for the Pico, no, Parkside, not Pico, well, it is sold by Pico now, but the Parkside Dundas brake van, I stole the wheels from that from. So I've ordered another set of wheels so I can build the 3 remaining kits, but anyway, so there you go. That's the main subject of this video, that little van, and he's now built and running.